For those of you who don't know, I joined Capital One only a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, I guess. This has been a really, really interesting experience jumping back into the identity space after a startup that we've been running. And this whole concept popped out of a bunch of conversations I was having with my team and other folks that were around the place as we started to think about visions for where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do. Bumped into Eve Mailer the other day in the lunchroom, and she said, "Hey, isn't this amazing? We're back in a position where we can do what we wanted to do at PayPal 10 years ago." And that's kind of where we are at this point. So I want to talk to you about some items here, and the place I want to start is by winding back the Wayback Machine to 2004. Okay, it's not quite that far, but it's about that. So where were we in 2004? This was Web 2.0. Web 2.0 was when O'Reilly said, "Hey, why don't we treat the web as a platform instead of these silly desktops? We could have your customers build your business for you because they could create content that would then be sold." Of course, everybody knows this never, ever happened, right? This was not a successful business plan, except some like huge, multi-billion-dollar corporations. So what was going on around this stage? Around about this time, we had Identity 2.0. And having looked around the room, I know there's a significant number of you that are actually unable to escape the knowledge that this is where we're up to. Any of you who have never seen Descartes' Identity 2.0 presentation, you should certainly take a look. What was fascinating about this is that as I bumped into a range of folks that had interesting opportunities in Capital One, I looked at them and said, "You do realize that we have tried to do all of this before?" And they're like, "What do you mean?" So we showed them Dick's presentation, and they said, "Oh my God, you mean 14 years ago this is exactly what you were trying to do?" I was like, "Yeah, guess what? It really was." So here was the idea. Whereas Web 2.0 allowed you to combine APIs in interesting and recombinable ways, Identity 2.0 was established on the basis of saying, "Hey, what if we put consumers in control of how their identity and their lives get lived? What would that look like?" It was around about the time that Microsoft had failed with their passport endeavors, and at that stage, we had actually just come out with the 7 Laws of Identity. God bless Kim Cameron. And you'll notice that 14, 15 years ago, the one at the top said consumer consent. So all of the activities we're like hard at work on at the moment say, "Hey, we really need to get into this." The identity space, particularly for consumers, we've been working on this now for at least 15 years. It was really, really well understood, and it was understood to be one of the things that either enabled or inhibited your likelihood to have success. And around that time, we kicked off with information cards. Anybody remember information cards? Yes. Oh, look, way more old people than I expected. I was there like pretty much at the start of the Information Card Foundation. That's actually what, in conjunction with the Open ID Foundation, of which I was also a board member, kicked off the Open Identity Exchange, just to give you a sense. OpenID at that point, OpenID was about, why don't you get to create your own identity and manage it? You should all be identity providers. And OAuth wasn't about protecting APIs. OAuth was about the valet key that allowed you to share information. This was all about consumer identity. We just happen to have subverted all of the technologies and techniques these days and applied them to what we now call identity and access management. And I like to posit has nothing to do with consumer identity at all. And maybe it's time we actually rethought that. So that's the premise. Okay, this is me. Nobody ran for the back of the room, so that's not a bad start. Me interacts with a bunch of places. What do those places know or think about me? Well, they actually have representations of me that actually are the handles that they work all of the activities and engagements that are associated with me. These are my user accounts. This is what I am is actually all about. This is the management of these accounts at individual places scattered all over the internet. This is single sign-on or federation. This is where we actually have me represented by some accounts where I actually get to log in at a bunch of these places. Not a bad thing. We're building a huge and really, really effective economy out of this. The whole reason the conference is here is we're pretty much making money out of this space. We're working on really hard problems. This is all good stuff. It's not identity management. Identities have to do with all of the stuff that's about me. Way more than any individual particular place I work in happens to know. And at some point, for some use cases, that gets connected back to the real me. So this is identity and access management, better known as user account management. This is identity management. This is real-world identity. This is what my bank actually tends to do a lot of, which is, hey, how do you tie me and that set of information you know back to some set of accounts that it could actually interoperate and work effectively in this space? I want my identity back again, man. Seriously. So given that we've been at this for 15 years, the quite rational and reasonable question is, where are all those identity businesses that we posited would be like coming out of our ears by now? I wrote a white paper many years ago at PayPal, which was called The Steady State of the Identity Universe Theory. And it basically said, hey, if you kick forward 20 years, we have all this stuff work, we'll have amazing amounts of opportunity. The problem is we're not there. We're actually 2 billionths of a second after the Big Bang, and the physical laws of the universe are different. We are still trying to work out what those physical laws are. Welcome to the current world. Identity providers, we've had a lot. We've had, I should keep most of these names, probably under the covers, but various large companies have had runs at being identity providers. Identity technology companies abound. They're all here. We're dealing with customer IAM. Customer IAM or SIAM has nothing to do with consumer identity. It just happens to be enterprise identity reapplied. ID proofing, we're working hard at that. With some of the places that we rely on have actually been a bit of a disappointment to us, but there we go. And then social network providers, including the large and consistent ones that we all know of. I was in a presentation once for NIST where everybody was saying there was no such thing as an identity provider. Somebody reminded me of this today. I looked up and said, hi, my name's Andrew Nash. I run identity at Google and I'm an identity provider. But there aren't too many around the place, honestly. This is actually kind of a disappointing spot. Pretty much everybody that's engaged in this space is primarily looking at managing identities for businesses. And the real question is, who's managing identities for people? Anyone wanting to launch into this space would take a look at this and say, this is the stupidest thing on earth. This makes no sense. Why on earth would you do this? And as Buttercup said, hey, we'll never survive. I really like Wesley's response, which is nonsense. You're only saying that because no one ever has. So what might this look like for consumers? Well, there's lots and lots of really interesting things that we could build in here. My favorite ones that I pulled out from about 10 years ago was, hey, I'd like my information on my device under my control. I'd really like to be the me that I need to be in different circumstances. I'd like my life on the internet to be simplified, more effective, and much more powerful in terms of the way I deal with it. By the way, I'd like to have you forget who I am. Maybe that just means no longer updating information, but I'd like to actually have some of these returned to me in terms of control. Overall, in the context of all the stuff that we'd like to do here, however, this is still the law of identity number one. It's like consumer consent and control. So bear in mind everything that I'm poking at here in this fairly short presentation, come back to just exactly that. So why haven't we made more progress in this space? And the answer is we keep trying to solve this stuff based on the fact that we need to build better technologies. And recently, having gone back to re-examine a range of these, what I've found is that we now have more technology than we can possibly imagine. Every time I raise this question, somebody says, oh no, you don't understand sovereign. Or no, you don't understand blockchain because this will take care of this for you. Oh no, you need to have decentralized IDs because those will actually ensure all of this happens. And I had a conversation in the hallway today and with somebody who should remain nameless, and they said, after 15 years, you'd hope we'd actually made this simpler. We appear to have a way, way, way more complex environment, all of which seems to be an indication that we may actually not be effective at solving this with technology. So there's at least a whole presentation here which I made my executive team suffer through around exactly why identities succeed or fail. Can't really touch on a whole range of those, but let's just touch on a couple of these. Here's one of the bigger challenges. It's called coverage. If my users go to only 1 in 50 websites and get access to the services they need, they try this like 3 times and then give up on me. If I go and pitch and say, hey, I've got some really interesting information I'd like to share with you as a relying party or retailer, and I can only represent 10% of their identities, guess what? They have other things to do. There's nothing in the technology space that addresses this problem. But this is actually one of the most key and most significant kind of points to actually making progress in this space, which is how do I actually get to that critical mass that allows all of those great and amazing promises to actually occur? Anybody around when the moon landing actually occurred? Oh, God, there really are some old ones here. Here's my recollection of the moon landing. I was pretty much from that point continually and totally disappointed every day because I didn't get to go to the moon. I'm kind of running out of time at this point. It's a bit of the way I feel about identity in this space, which is, God damn it, it's about time we actually managed to make this stuff work. There's a range of other kind of issues here that we could happily touch on and address, but tightly coupled solutions is one of these. This is one of the early ones I discovered when I poked at this at PayPal, which said, hey, how are we going to make this stuff work? And people said, you don't understand. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of relying parties that all know how to use the same content and information. We'll be able to sign in once and go to any of those. And I said, wow, how do we get those hundreds of thousands of companies to be invested in this? Oh, you clearly don't understand very much. We have hundreds of millions of consumers that are just waiting to get access to these businesses. Where did those hundreds of millions of consumers come from? Oh, you weren't listening. We've got hundreds of thousands of businesses just waiting to provide them access to information. Right there is the tightly coupled problem, and the one that we don't ever seem to get out of our own way around. There's a very, very long presentation here, which at some point I may be unveiled to talk about, but we've been living some of these interesting challenges for a while right now. Technology base has never, ever really been our problem. Frankly, we could have done this with X509 if we'd really wanted to. We had a few screwed up user interfaces. We could have done this with OpenID and with OAuth. Might have been a little difficult. We just keep throwing technology at this problem. We don't seem to be taking a whole lot of activity or moving this along. What is true, however, is it feels like we are on the uptick again. For those of you who've been around long enough, you'll maybe recognize, as I do, that there's this cycle that occurs. So there is a time in the affairs of men, or there is a season, depending on which your particular bent is. And it feels like we're there today. That every time I look around, like I literally have had 7 consortia approach me in the last 3 weeks saying, you need to understand that if you joined us, you could make all of this identity stuff work. All of the conversations I've been having are all tending to orient around, hey, why couldn't we actually pull this stuff together? The sense I have is that this is actually a time when, if we could work out how to grab some of the threads that we have in our hands at the moment, hopefully without the complexity level, then maybe there's actually a chance to take another run at this. So maybe I'm an outrageous optimistic. Those of you who know Pam know that that's what the name of her blog used to be, Eternal Optimist. And despite some of my curmudgeonly expectations, I actually think there's a chance here for this. So I just want to poke at 1 or 2 things here, and I want to talk about attributes just for a minute. So this is the Dread Pirate Roberts. And so this is the description that Wesley's talking about. Roberts had grown so rich, he wanted to retire. He took me to his cabin, he told me his secret. I am not the Dread Pirate Roberts, he said. My name is Ryan. I inherited the ship from the previous Dread Pirate Roberts, just as you will inherit it from me. The man I inherited it from is not the real Dread Pirate Roberts either. His name was Cummerbund. The real Roberts has been retired 15 years and living like a king in Patagonia. So now here's the interesting question. What is the Dread Pirate Roberts attribute in this particular case? So if I discover someone about to board my boat and he claims to be Wesley, nobody is going to give him the slightest time of day. However, if you board the boat screaming, I'm the Dread Pirate Roberts, you get all of the right reactions. Now, in the world of real-world identification, what we would be trying to do at this point is to work out what your KBA-based interactions are to work out if you really are the real Dread Pirate Roberts. Because if we could like make that association, we could send you off and say, hey, this is a fraudulent transaction, somebody cart Wesley away. The real question though is, if he's like boarding my ship with a damn sword, what's the most important aspect of this? The real world identity or the fact that there's an attribute that says, hey, there's something interesting about the guy who like is waving this cutlass around the place. One of the things that I've found fascinating over the years is that I've posited for a while now that if I, instead of looking at the problems we're dealing with as identity problems, and by the way, I keep telling my folks, until I get rid of the term identity in all of my value propositions, I don't think I'm actually going to be making any progress. We need to hide this damn stuff instead of celebrating it. I think I could actually build out pretty much any identity and access management system based on the use of attributes as opposed to our current deployments. I know I can't build out attribute systems based on our current IAM systems. Right there's a really, really interesting question to answer, because there's a point here about how do we actually get into an environment where we could share information in some trusted way. Trust is a big topic at the moment. Sovereign like to say, hey, we have a trust network, we take care of that. Of course, the fact is they actually are primarily interested in sharing trust about public keys, don't appear to understand the difference between PKI and PGP, and by the way, are still exposed to the PGP web of trust problem, which includes the potential for major collusion, but leaving all that aside, we're making some progress in trust, apparently. So the real question is, who would you trust in this space? And I'm still positing this, which is, in the midst of all of this complexity that's going on, where we keep throwing technology at a problem and don't seem to be making any change, maybe this is a time to actually rethink trusted entities in this space. There are lots of issues with this. I'm sure I'll have any number of people arguing with me over beer later on at the party tonight. But if we had an entity that consumers fundamentally thought that they could put some level of trust in, then all of the activity I'm trying to be engaged in around building really complex peer-to-peer trust models actually are no longer necessary in most cases. Maybe it's something worth thinking about. So here's the point where I actually want to get to. I think it's about time that we gave Wesley his identity back. So I think it's time that we started to be able to identify Wesley in the morning. And this is what I'm currently invested in. So my poor long-suffering team at Capital One is looking at me saying, what on earth is going on here? They are actually, to be fair, coming along for a ride that is actually pretty damn exciting. I'm interested in like reconstructing the whole approach that we have on dealing with identities, attributes, and identity information, assuming a model in which we actually have consumers trust us and we can actually ensure their consent, which is, could we actually build some pragmatic systems right now where we actually gave people the opportunities to share information that could change their lives for good? You'd all make wonderful Dread Pirate Roberts. And if you have any interest in this conversation, I would love to talk to you. That's my email. So I think that we're pretty much on time, but we okay for a couple of questions? Okay. Is anybody that wants to throw rocks at this point? The question is trust just binary? Should we think about it as more than zeros and ones? Here's one of the interesting things you find when you actually try to build one of these systems. All the things that we tend to think about as trust in a formal kind of fashion get thrown out the window, because when I deal with consumers, it turns out that brand trust trumps pretty much all of it, which actually is a really, really hard thing to calculate when you're thinking about what is the formal trust anchor that I need to deal with in this space. Is trust binary? I'm not sure I actually know anymore, to tell you the truth. I know that you and I could be trusted, but I think that there's an opportunity where such a thing as a trust anchor as an entity actually exists, and that could be the basis of trust for a range of people. Anything else? And, oh, one more. Oh, no, down, I'm sunk now. Right. So the question is, given that there are different contexts, let me try to translate shortly, that given there are different contexts and trust means different things in different spaces, how do you deal with the fact that you can't be trusted in all cases? Is that reasonable? At least close for this one. I'm building pragmatic systems that actually are going to approach a subset of cases, and I don't think I actually need to solve all of them. So I think the challenge I would throw at is, I'm pretty sure I know how to address a reasonable subset of these. I'm looking for other people that might have some of the other pieces to actually address in that space. So I'm actually going to sidestep the question in this particular case, because that's how you build pragmatic systems. All right, I think we're actually out of time. You guys have been amazing to actually come in. Thank you. I know it's the end of a long, long week for you. More than happy to share over beer this evening, but thanks again. Appreciate it.